Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I would like to welcome you to the fourth lecture in this series on research methodology. In this lecture, we will define what ethics are. We'll also look at different legal issues with unethical behavior in research. Guidelines for ethical standards. We'll talk about plagiarism. And we'll talk about ways how to use others' research in building a case for our own research study. Here is dictionary meaning of ethics. Ethics is a system of moral principles or values. Now the question is, what is a principle? A principle is a basic truth, law, or assumption. What is value? A value is a principle, standard, or quality considered worthwhile. Here are some problems with research, unethical behavior in research. In a survey of 1,100 researchers at American universities with 245 respondents, 88% believed that fraud was uncommon among researchers. However, 32% reported that they had a colleague that they suspected of falsifying data. And when asked for major motives of that intellectual fraud or unethical behavior, they reported desire for fame and recognition, job security, firm belief or wish to promote a theory, laziness. Similarly, misrepresentation, failure to credit or fully credit deserving contributors, or crediting or over-crediting someone who did not deserve that much credit. So these are all unethical behaviors. You'll be surprised to find out the history of unethical behavior in research. I'm giving you some examples only from American perspective, but this does not mean that these are the only unethical behaviors in research. European history is also full of unethical behaviors. Some of those examples include Tuskegee syphilis study. In this research, researchers injected healthy people with syphilis virus without their knowledge. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to find out how syphilis virus develops in a body over a long period of time. So basically those researchers played with the lives of human beings. Similarly, radiation experiment. In jails, the researchers bombarded prisoners with radiation without their knowledge. And the purpose was to find out effects of radiation on human body. Similarly, cancer cell experiment. That researchers knowingly and willfully grew cancer cells in their patients. Biological agent studies. Researchers sprayed the whole city of San Francisco with a chemical agent. And LSD experiments, CIA, Central Investigation Agency of United States of America, they conducted these type of experiments. This led to 1974 US National Research Act, in which they mandated that all federally funded research proposals must go through an institutional review board. History of European research is also full of these types of examples. So without going into further details of these incidents, the lesson that we can learn from these things is that we should be highly ethical in our research problems, in our research methods. Let's see. The foremost thing, whenever you involve someone in your research, you should do is, you should provide an informed consent letter. That informed consent letter should include the following: purpose of the research, identity and credentials of the researcher, the research process, how long the participants will be involved, an offer to withdraw from research at any time for any reason, potential benefits to participants as well as to society, potential harm or discomfort to individual, an assurance that results will be kept in strictest confidence, how to get a copy of the results, how you can be reached should anyone have any questions, and a place for prospective subjects to sign indicating that they agree to participate. Or if you are involving children in your research, their parents should be able to sign that consent letter. Similarly, what procedure will you use to ensure confidentiality of the data? You should also answer a question. How do you plan to debrief the participants? For example, your research study might focus on something where you do not really want to tell your participants what you are doing at the beginning. Some behavioral studies and some types of behavioral studies, you might want to do that. But you should have a mechanism to debrief those participants. What have you done? But before we do that, there should be an institutional review board in different organizations, or a third party who should be able to tell us whether the research that we are conducting poses harm to the individuals who are participating in that type of research. And an important thing to consider is that why do we do research anyway? We do research to increase our understanding of how and why we behave the way we do, if this is behavioral type of research. Now, you might think that in computer science, we might not be dealing with these types of issues. We might not be dealing with human beings. For example, if we are doing research on grid computing, or we are developing agent systems. But think about it. Computer science is a broad field. Computer science includes those things that I just mentioned, but it also includes behavioral aspect, how people use technology, how people adopt technology. So we should consider all those things when we are conducting these type of research. Obviously, it's not as dangerous as injecting syphilis virus into subject's body, but still there could be some psychological impacts of your behavioral type research in computer science. So you should be aware of those things, and you should make sure that the participants are also aware of those things, and there is no risk or harm to the participants. Here are a few basic principles of ethical research. You must protect participants from physical or psychological harm. You must ensure that information about individual does not become public. You must not coerce people to participate. You must ensure that participants know and understand what is involved. When using children, you must gain permission from parents and use extra caution. Information about participants should be held in confidence. At the end of the experiment, you must explain the study to each participant. Similarly, we should use computer simulation if possible. If treatment is harmful, try to find population that has already been naturally treated. For example, if this is a medical research, there might already be people who have developed that type of disease that you want to conduct your research on. Always secure informed consent. If possible, report summary data rather than individual results. And an important aspect, always get your design viewed. Now we will be talking about another type of ethical issue. And the interesting aspect is that this type of ethical issue does not only relate to your research, it also relates to your everyday assignments. And that issue is plagiarism. What is plagiarism? Plagiarism is the act of presenting words, ideas, images, sounds, or the creative expression of others as your own. You might have seen people copying their assignments. Well, researchers do that too. And there are some serious consequences when they are caught. A study of almost 4,500 students at 25 schools in the United States suggested cheating is a significant problem in high school. 74% of the respondents admitted to one or more instances of serious test cheating. 72% admitted to serious cheating on a written assignment. Just imagine. So if children in schools are cheating, what type of researchers would they make? So we have to make sure that we avoid this type of ethical issue. And how do you know whether you have plagiarized or not? If you have included the words and ideas of others in your work that you neglected to cite. You did not explain that this idea is coming from someone else. That means you have plagiarized. Similarly, you have had help you wouldn't want your teacher to know about. Means you have cheated on that assignment. Similarly, if you do not want your reviewers to know about something you have quoted or you have included in your research, or your readers for that matter, you have probably plagiarized. So you always want to avoid this type of unethical behavior. There are two types of plagiarisms: intentional plagiarism and unintentional plagiarism. Intentional plagiarism includes copying of someone else's work, buying or borrowing papers, cutting and pasting blocks of text from electronic source without documenting, media borrowing without documentation, web publishing without permission of the creators. And when I said documentation, I meant proper citation. In unintentional type of plagiarism, careless paraphrasing. What is paraphrasing? Paraphrasing is describing someone else's ideas in your own words. So a careless paraphrasing in which you did not cite, you thought since you have rephrased it, you have explained it in your own words, now it's your idea. No, it's still not your idea. The idea came from someone else. You need to cite it. You need to give reference. You need to give credit to the original author of that idea. Similarly, poor documentation or quoting excessively, that your paper is full of quotations. Quotation itself is not plagiarism, but if you overquote, if every second sentence of your document or your paper or research study is quoted from someone else, it is plagiarism, even though it's unintentional type of plagiarism. Similarly, failure to use your own voice. A research study must include your own voice. You use someone else's research to build a case for your own study. Okay, now here are some of the excuses that over the period of time while teaching this class, I have got from different students. Why should we be ethical? Why should we not copy? Why should we not plagiarize? And the reasons behind that questions are as follows. When you copy, you cheat yourself. You limit your own learning. The consequences are not worth the risk. It's only right to give credit to authors whose ideas you use. Citing gives authority to the information you present. Citing makes it possible for your readers to locate your source. Research is not a me versus them game. It's about learning to learn. And cheating is unethical behavior anyway. So what are the possible consequences? If you search this topic on internet, you'll find out a lot of stories about a lot of researchers being caught. And what happens to them when they are caught? Their reputation as a researcher is at stake. They sometimes lose their jobs. And it is very difficult to build a credibility again once you have been caught plagiarizing. Just imagine if your architect cheated on their math exam, what type of engineer would they be? If your doctor had cheated on their exams, what type of diagnosis would they do for you? So think about this in any field, and you'll find out that cheating and plagiarizing is not only unethical, it is highly dangerous for others. So we always want to avoid plagiarism. We do not want to plagiarize. So does this mean we need to cite everything? The answer is no. We don't need to cite everything, especially the ones that are common knowledge. And what is common knowledge? Facts that are widely known or information or judgments considered common knowledge. We do not need to document them. We do not need to cite them. For example, if you say world is round, it's a common knowledge. You don't need to cite this. Similarly, if someone says computer networking is transmission of ones and zeros, it's a common knowledge. Everyone knows about that. We don't need to cite this. So how do we find out whether something is common knowledge and something is not common knowledge? You do it by this mechanism. When you are doing your literature review, if you find the same thing with 3 authors, that means probably that fact is common knowledge. And we do not need to cite that. But remember, whenever you are in doubt, cite, give reference. We do not need to document, we do not need to give reference when we are discussing our own experiences, observations, or reactions. We do not need to cite that because they are our own ideas, our own feelings, our own findings, our own observations and reactions and experiences. Similarly, when we are compiling the results of original research from scientific experiments or surveys or whatever type of research method you have used, we don't need to cite that. Others will cite that when they will use our research for their own research method, for their own research studies. Similarly, if you're using common knowledge, we have already talked about that. Okay, now here's another question. If I change a few words, am I okay? The answer is no. Paraphrasing, changing a few words or explaining the same idea in different words in your own words means paraphrasing. Paraphrasing original ideas without documenting your source is plagiarism. You cannot do that. But we can borrow from the work of others. In our own, we have already talked about that good research always builds upon others' work, what others have done. So how do we do that? So how do we use others' research? We use others' research in the following three manners. We quote, we paraphrase, we summarize. Have to make sure to use a blend of different source materials, making sure that your own voice is heard. Your voice should not get lost in those different types of citations. You should use citations. That's an important aspect of research, but you should make sure that your voice remains important. So how do we quote? Quotations are exact words of an author copied directly from a source, word for word. You sometimes even use quotation marks to make sure that the readers understand that this is not your idea and you are borrowing that idea to build your own case. Make sure you must cite every quotation. When do we use quotations? We use quotations when we want to add power of an author's words to support our own argument, or if we want to disagree with an author. Then we cite, then we quote. Similarly, if you want to highlight particularly eloquent or powerful phrases or passages, then you quote. When you are comparing and contrasting specific points of view, or if you want to note the important research that precedes your own. And you can see I have cited this text. These are the people who actually wrote this one. Similarly, how do we paraphrase? Paraphrasing means rephrasing the words of an author, putting his or her own thoughts in your own words. When you paraphrase, you rework the source idea, words, phrases, and sentences structure with your own. However, as we have discussed earlier, it's still not yours, it's someone else's. You need to cite this type of paraphrasing. You need to cite that. You need to give reference. When do we paraphrase? When we plan to use information in our own note cards and wish to avoid plagiarism. We want to avoid overusing quotations. We want to use our own voice to present information. This is where we paraphrase. How do we summarize? Summarizing involves putting the main idea of one or several writers in your own words, including only the main points. Summaries are significantly shorter than the original and take a broad overview of the source material. Once again, it is extremely important to cite those summaries. When do we summarize? When we want to establish background or offer an overview of a topic. We want to describe knowledge about a topic. Want to determine the main ideas of a single source. This is where we summarize. So how do we know? How do we decide which strategy to use where and when? When you are reading your literature, during that review process, you include any direct quotes or unique phrases in quotation marks or mark them with a big Q. This will help you understand that this is the quote that you want to include in your own research. And make sure that the writer's name is identified. Similarly, When you want to paraphrase, when you are reading, write a big P. Similarly, include page numbers and source reference so that you can go back and check for accuracy as you write. Now we move on to the next important aspect. How do we cite? How do we document that we are citing something from someone else? This is called in-text documentation, when you are using someone else's work in the middle of your own paragraph. So how do we do that? The purpose is to give immediate source information without interrupting the flow of paper or the project or the research study. In-text documentation is taken very seriously. Inaccurate documentation is as serious as having no documentation at all. We need to be brief, provide brief information in in-text documentation, and it should match source information in the works cited or the references section at the end of your research paper. You must use an original idea from one of your sources, whether you quote or paraphrase it. You summarize original ideas from one of your sources. You use factual information that is not common knowledge. You quote directly from a source. You use a date or fact that might be disputed. That's when you document. And how do we cite? There are different styles, just like there were different mechanisms to rank journals and conferences. Similarly, there are different mechanisms to cite your in-text documentation. Some of those styles are APA styles, American Psychological Association. They have their own style. Similarly, MLA or the Howard style. Usually, we cite author's last name and year of publication in in-text documentation. In the absence of an author, cite the title and the year of publication. If you're using more than one book or paper by the same author, list the last name, year, title in a sequence. If you identify the author and the title in the text, just list the year of publication. You should remember that every journal and every conference has a different style for this type of documentation. So whenever you are submitting your paper to a journal or a conference, you should make sure to follow their style. Some would say that we will follow Howard style. So all the specifications of Howard style will go into that, and that journal or the conference does not provide any further information on that. So you need to go back to the source of Howard style and find out how to cite. But sometimes, rather most of the time, conferences and journals will provide you with a sample paper, and you'll use that sample paper to build your own case. This is the end of our fourth lecture in this series. I hope to see you next week. Allah Hafiz.